Something is happening in the shadows of Johannesburg, quiet, deliberate, and unsettling for those who once controlled the flow of Africa's money. Because this time, South Africa isn't asking for permission. It's making a declaration. The nation has just pulled off what few expected, a $500 million funding initiative that has global lenders lining up not to dictate terms, but to meet them. And that changes everything. This isn't charity, it's strategy. Because when Africa's most industrialized country decides it will no longer borrow under anyone else's conditions, the story stops being about money and starts being about power. But what does this mean for South Africa and for the future of Africa itself? There are moments in history when power doesn't make noise. It doesn't need to. It rearranges the room quietly. And what just happened in South Africa is one of those moments. No fireworks, no breaking news alerts, just a single statement from the National Treasury. And the world suddenly realized something fundamental had shifted. The Treasury confirmed it had received over 100 international proposals for its $500 million foreign currency funding initiative. At first, it sounded routine, just another government raising capital. But to anyone who understands global finance, this was seismic. Because South Africa wasn't begging for money, it was holding an open audition. Instead of lenders tightening their grip, they rushed forward with offers. Behind that calm press release was a revolution. Quiet, intelligent, and strategic. For decades, Africa's financial narratives were written elsewhere, in Washington, London, and Paris. But this time, the script wasn't printed overseas. It was written in Pretoria. That $500 million figure wasn't just a number. It was a signal that South Africa was done negotiating from weakness. This wasn't about chasing liquidity. It was about testing authority. It was South Africa saying to the world, "We no longer measure progress by what you lend. We measure it by how we decide to borrow." And that subtle shift in tone changed everything. More than 100 proposals came pouring in, from major investment houses, boutique firms, ESG-linked funds, and private financiers, all eager to be part of South Africa's next chapter. Each came with their own terms, but one message was loud and clear. Global investors now see South Africa as a marketplace of stability, not risk. That caught analysts off guard, because right now the world economy is tight. Interest rates are high, developing nations are struggling, and the IMF is tightening its rules. And yet, in this same climate, investors were competing to lend to South Africa. Why? Because the Treasury wasn't improvising, it was orchestrating. This wasn't a desperate plea for cash. It was a carefully designed model, crafted months in advance, announced quietly in July 2025. And it was built to send a message to the world. Africa doesn't need to crawl through the corridors of the IMF to finance its future. The Treasury targeted innovative instruments, bilateral term loans, structured notes, and private placements. They weren't just seeking capital, they were building control. Because when every lender operates under South Africa's terms, laws, and timelines, the leverage shifts. For once, the center of financial gravity moved from New York and London to Johannesburg. That's not symbolism, that's systemic power. In global finance, credibility is currency, and this move just raised South Africa's credit. Not on paper, but in perception. Investors aren't lending out of sympathy. They're lending out of trust. Trust in a system, trust in a strategy, trust in a country that has learned to master the language of money. This confidence didn't appear overnight. It was forged in crisis. Power shortages, downgrades, political storms, and inequality. But from that fire came discipline, And that discipline gave South Africa something far rarer than capital: credibility. The real story isn't how many offers came in, it's why they came now. What changed in South Africa's posture that made global lenders chase the borrower? The answer lies in how Pretoria flipped the financial script. For decades, African nations were told there was only one respectable path to global capital: Eurobonds or IMF loans. Issue debt in dollars, pay interest in dollars, and live under Western credit ratings. It looked neutral, but the strings were invisible: policy conditions, reform requirements, and restrictions on how nations could spend their own money. South Africa's new approach didn't just tweak that model. It flipped it upside down. Pretoria invited multiple forms of financing: bilateral loans, ESG-linked instruments, structured deals, each negotiated on equal footing. No longer one size fits all. No longer dictated by Western norms. It's a marketplace of ideas. That's the essence of this rebellion. Subtle, intelligent, and almost philosophical. Because South Africa isn't rejecting Western capital, it's refusing Western conditions. By designing deals aligned with its own sustainability goals, Pretoria forced global investors to connect profit with purpose. You want returns? Fine. But your returns must serve our development, not your geopolitics. That's not defiance. That's evolution. This structure forces investors to respect the borrower. And that's why they're coming. They're not just buying exposure to a fragile economy. They're buying into a system that manages risk through design. And behind that design lies psychological independence, the quiet power of a nation that no longer calls itself desperate. Because when you stop presenting yourself as needy, the market stops treating you as vulnerable. This is the genius behind South Africa's move. Pretoria didn't ask for sympathy. It offered strategy. It didn't call itself a debtor. It positioned itself as a partner in innovation. And that's why capital came running. Investors aren't lending to a government anymore. They're investing in an attitude, one that says, "We know what we want, and we'll take it on our terms." South Africa didn't challenge the market by shouting against it. It dismantled the argument beneath it. It exposed the illusion that borrowing equals submission, and it replaced it with a diversified, resilient financial system. For decades, Africa's financial narratives were written elsewhere, in Washington, London, and Paris. But this time, the script wasn't printed overseas. It was written in Pretoria. That $500 million figure wasn't just a number. It was a signal that South Africa was done negotiating from weakness. This wasn't about chasing liquidity. It was about testing authority. It was South Africa saying to the world, "We no longer measure progress by what you lend. We measure it by how we decide to borrow." And that subtle shift in tone changed everything. For the first time, Africa's largest industrial nation is proving that sovereignty doesn't mean isolation. It means choice. It's not rejecting global capital. It's redefining the terms of engagement. When you control the terms, you control the narrative. And when you control the narrative, you shape the future. This financial revolution won't stay in one country. Momentum like this spreads. It inspires imitation. Within months, financial thinkers from Lagos, Luanda, and Accra began noticing something new. Not in the spreadsheets, but in the tone. A quiet confidence spreading across Africa. Because confidence is contagious, something is happening in the shadows of Johannesburg, quiet, deliberate, and unsettling for those who once controlled the flow of Africa's money. Because this time, South Africa isn't asking for permission. It's making a declaration. The nation has just pulled off what few expected: a $500 million funding initiative that has global lenders lining up not to dictate terms, but to meet them. And that changes everything. This isn't charity, it's strategy. Because when Africa's most industrialized country decides it will no longer borrow under anyone else's conditions, the story stops being about money and starts being about power. But what does this mean for South Africa and for the future of Africa itself? For decades, Western institutions labeled Africa as high risk, no matter the evidence. But when top lenders line up under South Africa's new model, that old hierarchy starts to crumble. It proves what Africans have always known. The real risk wasn't economic, it was narrative. Pretoria's success didn't just attract investment, it dismantled a stereotype. It showed that risk is not geography, it's governance, and that discipline and sovereignty can coexist. That realization is echoing across African capitals, because when one nation rewrites the script, the rest start reading differently. South Africa stands now on the edge between ambition and accountability. Its credibility will be measured not by how creatively it borrows, but by how responsibly it delivers. Because every project that turns investment into production, every factory, every rail line, every energy plant, becomes another argument against the old order. Pretoria doesn't need to say it's sovereign anymore. It just needs to prove it, so effectively that doubt becomes irrational. Inspiration is temporary. Systems are permanent. But precision comes at a price. The more transparent a nation becomes, the more accountable it must be. And the more successful it gets, the more resistance it attracts, from within and without. Western lenders will quietly study South Africa, not as charity, but as competition. Domestically, political factions will ask who truly benefits. The next phase won't be defined by capital inflows, but by moral discipline. Can South Africa resist the pull of populism and stay focused on the long-term game? That will decide whether this becomes a foundation or a cautionary tale. And now comes the ultimate question. If one African nation can rewrite the rules of borrowing, can an entire continent rewrite the rules of power? Because this was never about $500 million. It was about what that money symbolizes. The birth of economic sovereignty 2.0. Not independence through isolation, but independence through intelligence. Sovereignty today isn't about walls or flags. It's about context, deciding which partnerships empower you and which weaken you. That's what South Africa has mastered. It took the same global financial system once used to control the developing world, and used its own complexity as leverage. That's not defiance, that's genius. Because when a nation once defined by colonial economics begins to master modern finance, it doesn't just gain wealth, it gains narrative power. For decades, Western analysts measured Africa in deficits of trust, of capacity, of governance. But now, those same institutions are competing to fund the very nations they once lectured. That's not coincidence. That's a paradigm collapse. If South Africa executes this model with discipline, it won't just redefine its own reputation. It will redefine how the world talks to Africa. Investors will no longer see the continent as a risk zone, but as a negotiation table, where deals aren't dictated but designed, where growth isn't conditional but mutual. This is Africa's new financial philosophy. Calm, strategic, and self-assured. It doesn't roar, it recalibrates. It doesn't protest, it performs. It doesn't demand attention, it earns respect. And that is exactly why it makes the old order nervous. Power built on dependency thrives in confusion, but power built on discipline creates clarity. And clarity is dangerous. Because when Africa begins to manage its capital with foresight, the illusion that it needs supervision collapses. The IMF loses its mystique. The World Bank loses its monopoly. And Africa stops being a project and becomes a participant. Once Africa's leading economies master independent financing, they start speaking to each other differently too. Trade, regional credit, joint development. The Pan-African dream stops being a slogan and starts becoming an infrastructure. That's the legacy of this $500 million. Not the money, the message. That Africa is no longer asking what it's worth, it's declaring it. Because sovereignty isn't a speech, it's a system. And when a system begins to work, quietly, confidently, on its own terms, that's when empires start to listen. So, What happens when Africa no longer borrows to survive, but to lead? That's not just a question for South Africa. That's a question for the future of power itself. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because here